Evil is real. That is a statement I make at the start of every episode of the Playing with Fire podcast. And I have to tell you, this week, it has been a palpable sense of evil. We have watched horrific events unfold in Israel, Hamas terrorists attacking the Jewish state. I take a deep breath as I even prepare to mention some of the atrocities. We have seen babies purportedly beheaded, at least one Holocaust survivor in a wheelchair hauled off by Hamas into Gaza, and so many other things, the targeting of women and children and the vulnerable and the elderly. It is incredibly shocking to watch these events and to see the Israeli people, the Israeli state in its fight for survival. And so when we try to make sense of these things, so often we look at things through a political sense, a temporal sense, and yet an event like this requires a deeper lens. It requires being able to understand that Ephesians 6 is real, that the spiritual battle that we face before us is true, and that people are, all of us, embroiled and have been throughout the arc of history in a battle between good and evil. And we are watching the evil manifest itself right now in what is happening in Israel and to the Israeli people. And so I want to talk about something that I don't normally talk about. I mean, we talk about evil on the show quite a bit, but the end times, right? This idea of eschatology, the study of the end of days, what the scriptures tell us about that. The first book that I ever wrote was called The Armageddon Code, and it was a book that dove into what Christians believe about the end times, about the end of days. And that particular book really was eye-opening because there are so many different debates and discussions about the end times. And that project brought me to Playing with Fire. And there's a connection between evil and the end of days. And so I want to just do something very quickly today. This is going to be a fast episode, quick episode, no guest. But I want to talk about the 5 reasons why a lot of Christians believe the end times are upon us, or nearby maybe. And nobody knows the day or the hour, but there are some reasons why when these sorts of events unfold, Christians start to talk about the end of days. And so I want to quickly move through those on this episode of the show to give you a sense of what is behind those discussions. Okay. So we know the culture itself, let's just start here, has become very captivated by apocalyptic themes. These storylines are in movies and TV shows. You've got shows about zombies and plagues. And look, we just lived a plague out, right, with COVID-19 and the way we handled it and all the debate around that. But the point is we've got a lot of content on TV and movies that focuses on zombies and plagues and other end times scenarios. But this idea of an Armageddon-like scenario, okay, this is not something that is relegated just to fictional plots. It's something that is deep in Christian theology. It is something we see throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. And in fact, a substantial part of the Bible itself deals with prophecy. Now, to pull back from end times prophecy itself, the prediction of events that are yet to come, Jesus' life was predicted throughout in his first coming, the Old Testament. The New Testament predicts his second coming, and that's where we move into the end of days scenarios, right? So we've got scripture already proof. There's already proof in scripture that a lot of it has come true with Jesus. Now we are seeing other end times theologies be presented both in old and new. And so as we look at this, though, getting into why do so many people want to talk about it? Why are so many people captivated by this? I spent time talking with 20 experts for the Armageddon Code. That's, again, the first book that I wrote on this topic. And you can check that book out if you're interested in going in depth. And through those interviews, there were a lot of things that came up that convinced these theologians and pastors that they believe that perhaps we are inching. I mean, we're always inching closer to the end of days, but perhaps it's closer than maybe some would assume. They talked about sweeping moral decay, biblical disconnectedness, the great falling away. They talked about ongoing violence in the Middle East. These were just some of the prophetic markers that they said were foretold thousands of years ago in the Old and New Testament, and yet they're watching these things, they believe, unfold and start to unfold in the world around us. Now, Jesus himself, he did foretell his own second coming, right? Christ also told us, though, in Matthew 24:36, again, nobody knows the day or the hour of his return. So while the Bible proclaims that humanity can't know when, Jesus did reveal to the disciples some of the signs of his second coming. And we find that in Matthew 24, 6 through 8, just a few verses before the aforementioned verse that I mentioned. And let me read that for you. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. So, we could argue there have always been wars, there have always been famines, there have always been earthquakes, but I think there is a sense among some, and even in the secular world, right? The climate conversation is very much focused on the changes that we are seeing happen to the weather. And while they may not attribute that to anything eternal, some people, the reality is there seems to be sweeping agreement that something is going on in our world, that something is happening. And so let's get into these 5 very specific elements that we are seeing unfold. Let's start with chaos in the Middle East. This is the first sign that has some convinced we are inching ever closer to the end of days. Now, Bible scholars, they look at the world and they say, look, there's constant chaos in the Middle East, but it is ramping up. And in recent years, we've seen that continue. We had the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan. You go back to 9/11. There have been decades now of complete chaos. This Hamas attack on Israel, it centers around, the very nation at the centerpiece of Revelation, where end times events are said to unfold, which is Israel. And so chaos in the Middle East is really the first sign that has some convinced that we are inching toward the end of days. And the second reason that's really tied to that is the rise of certain terror groups. The Islamic State, obviously, is one of them. We haven't heard as much about the Islamic State in the headlines, but we're talking about Hamas, right? So these terrorist groups that are all over the place, all over the world, in the Middle East and Africa and other countries as well, that is just another interesting piece here. There are people who will look to that and say, look, these people, these groups, they are evidence that we are marching toward the end of days. They are contributing to the chaos, and depending on where you stand on eschatology, will play a key role. So I won't spend a lot of time there, but I will tell you, in Armageddon Code, I get into Gog and Magog and Ezekiel and some of those other really interesting elements. Russia, obviously, a big topic, Russia popping up all over the news. And Russia, according to many, is Magog. And so Magog is mentioned as being part of the coalition that will try to battle against Israel. And so that brings us, though, really, and I think this is the biggest sign of the end times, right? And it's a sign that goes back decades now, but it's Israel's reemergence. And Israel's reemergence, this really happened in 1948. Israel, as a Jewish state, had been noticeably absent from the map for nearly 1900 years. There is no other country, I would challenge anybody to find one, that disappears for 1900 years and then reemerges back on the map. Israel is the only country that has happened with. And again, in order for the events to happen in Revelation that are foretold, which many people believe those events have not happened yet, then Israel has to be on the map for that to happen. So here's why that matters, though. Futurists who see the many Bible prophecies as being currently unfulfilled, they believe that they see in the Old and the New, not just Revelation, that Israel will come back. Ezekiel 36:24, written 2,500 years ago, it includes the following words that are attributed to God. It says, quote, "For I will take you out of the nations, I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back into your own land." There are different ideas on that, but futurists, those who look ahead to the future, they believe that the Old Testament verses are clearly referencing a future restoration of Israel. That is something that we did see happened at the end of the Holocaust, at the end of World War II in 1948. Thus, modern-day Israel was born, and many people will say this is the super sign of the end of days. And so we've had Israel back on the map for a while now, and the battling has not stopped, with this latest iteration of Hamas being part of that. Jeff Kinley, well-known prophecy expert and author, he said to me once, quote, "I cannot fathom how this modern-day prophetic fulfillment, a super sign of the end times, can be ignored." And you can find that quote and more in Armageddon Code. Again, I will point out there are other experts who would counter that that this verse and others were related to the Babylonian captivity, which we read about in the Old Testament. That's when the Jews were forcibly taken by King Nebuchadnezzar II. They were held in Babylonia after being expelled from Judah following its conquest back in 597 BC. They would say that's what it's referring to, not the 1948 recreation of Israel. Persian leader Cyrus the Great later also permitted the Jews to head back into their land in 538 BC, which could be perceived as a fulfillment of those prophecies, though the temple in Jerusalem again came under assault by the Romans in 70 AD, and that left the Jews scattered throughout the world for centuries, again until 1948 and that return. So that's our third sign, but the fourth is the shifts that we're seeing in morality. This is really an issue that has sparked a lot of intrigue. I think a lot of Christians are watching the world and they're sort of scratching their head. How did we get here? Things are so crazy. It's happening at a rapid rate. Traditional understandings of marriage and gender and sexuality and all these other issues are transforming very quickly. And at the same time, Christianity, at least those claiming that they adhere to Christianity or believe in it, they are dwindling. And so there's a lot to sort of unpack there, but the shifts in morality, Jesus talks about people being lovers of themselves, love waxing cold. Again, you can make arguments this has happened throughout history, but I do think we are watching from a 30,000 foot level this happen across the globe right now. And then the fifth sign, the spread of the gospel. This is interesting because the Christian gospel continues to be preached all over the place. And in America right now, despite the declines in Christianity, we're actually watching some really, and I say bizarre, but it's actually in a positive sense, amazing moments from the Asbury revival down to mass baptisms, all of these things that are going on. Even though there's cultural chaos, we're watching people discover and rediscover Christ at a rapid rate. And we're also watching people groups all over the world previously unexposed to the gospel suddenly learning about it. And so this matters to a lot of Bible experts because Christ, after his resurrection, went to the disciples and said, hey, and you can find this in Matthew 28:19, go and make disciples of all nations. So Jesus also mentioned this, preaching of scripture throughout the world earlier, and this was in the book of Matthew, as a sign of the end times, right? So preaching the gospel, reaching people with the truth, that was going to be tied to this. If you look at Matthew 24:14, Jesus said, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. That seems like a pretty interesting verse to me. So right now you've got missiologists and Bibles. You've got people printing Bibles secretly and distributing them and smuggling them into places like Iran and China. And so it's very interesting to watch that unfold. So those are just some of the reasons why some Christian leaders believe that the biblical end times are approaching. I write a lot more about this debate and I get very into the weeds, which I think some people like, some people don't. But if you're interested in getting into all of those battles about the end times, you can grab the Armageddon Code, and you can find that wherever books are sold. And I want to tease a great interview that's coming up. This is sort of a bonus episode here, but Ray Comfort is coming on the show, and he's going to be talking in just a few days about a number of topics, but among them, how he confronted evil, dealt with evil in his ministry, and some of the really terrifying but yet hope-filled stories that he has encountered on his journey dealing with, again, real-life evil. That's Ray Comfort. He'll be here on the Playing with Fire podcast very soon. I appreciate you listening, and I'll see you all again very soon.